In the grim darkness of the far future, every whisper echoes with dread, and every shadow promises unspeakable horror. Welcome to Grimdark Shards, where we breathe life into tales forged in the endless war-torn night of Warhammer 40,000. Prepare yourself for a twisted voyage into the unknown, where the Imperium's bravest souls and its darkest secrets collide. Before we embark, remember to subscribe, strike the like icon, and sound the bell of notification. By doing so, you join us in this stand against the encroaching void. Now steel your nerves, gather your resolve, and let us delve into yet another tale of the grim darkness. Echoes of the Void, the fall of Sanctum Station. In the deepest dark of the void, listen for the silent screams. Listen, for they echo the secrets we must never name. Fragment from the Librarium Obscurus, archived in the Port Wonder Administratum. Chapter 1. Arrival. The Ascendant Mercy was a modest merchant vessel by Imperial standards, though to those who crewed her and knew each rivet and corridor by heart, she was a veritable city in the stars. Her hull was battered by centuries of warp travel, its once proud Imperial eagles faded by cosmic rays and the scouring dust of the void. Yet her machine spirit remained loyal. Countless repairs and supplications to the Adeptus Mechanicus had kept her hale enough to bear cargo across distant subsectors. The captain's line boasted a storied warrant of trade, albeit a minor one, overshadowed by the mightier rogue traders whose names commanded entire fleets. The vessel's last assignment was unremarkable on paper: deliver refined metals, ration packs, and small Mechanicus-engineered generator components to an Imperial space station known as Sanctum Station in a remote stretch of void beyond well-traveled shipping lanes. The station's official designation was Old Outpost 9C, Sanctum, but it was rumored among Carto artificers to be more than a mere outpost. Whispers told of a labyrinthine structure, a glorified fortress, or perhaps an ancient hub that had changed hands multiple times over the centuries. No one aboard Ascendant Mercy truly knew. Their job was simply to bring goods in exchange for local produce or ore. If the station had a modest population and the trade-off suited the Imperium's plan, that was enough. In the Ascendant Mercy's dimly lit command deck, Captain Livia Rent was flanked by her senior officers. She was a hard-eyed woman in her late 50s, clad in a reinforced coat, threaded with the usual filigree of pseudo-religious charms. Each patch, each aquila, bore witness to half a lifetime spent plying the stars. Her first officer, Tristan Hale, was a lean man of few words but unwavering loyalty. In the corner, the ship's confessor, Father Holsek, whispered prayers to the Emperor beneath his breath as the helmsman guided the vessel closer to Sanctum Station. They were far outside typical trade corridors. Even the local star was a dimly flickering orb, giving little cosmic illumination. The station itself should have been visible on the sensors, shining with the faint heat of thousands of souls living within. Yet the auger arrays crackled with interference, and the station's transponder beacon was strangely muted. Vox attempts brought only the hiss of static. "Final approach, Captain," announced Tristan, leaning over the sensorium console. "We have them on short range. Still no formal docking instructions. We might have to attempt manual override." Rent nodded, her jaw tightening. Stations typically maintained a small staff of traffic controllers or half-sentient servitor systems to guide incoming ships. The absence of any formal contact was unsettling. "Go to minimal thrusters," she ordered. "Keep trying that channel, Hale. I'm not taking us blind into a docking collar if their systems are malfunctioning." At the helm, Chief Navigator Tarrell Studer, no sanctioned mutant, merely a spindly man who specialized in real space charting, frowned at the flickering runes on his console. "I can read the docking bay configuration from standard patterns, Captain. Seems large enough for an in-hull docking, rather than an external clamp. If the station's gravity plating is functional, we can seal once inside." Her eyes remained on the forward picked slate. With an uneasy hush, the Ascendant Mercy drifted closer to the station's outer docking ring. The structure loomed into view, its hull black as pitch, marked here or there by the struts of enormous docking pylons. She expected blinking hazard beacons. Instead, she saw only darkness. A faint metallic gleam suggested that the station's outer surfaces possessed some polished plating, but no running lights burned. When the docking clamp automatically extended, it did so without fanfare. An archaic mechanical arm rose from the blackness, locking onto the Ascendant Mercy's port side with a clang. The interior monitors whined, then stabilized. A green lumen flickered in recognition. The docking seal was apparently intact, but no one hailed them. No harbormaster's voice crackled through the vox. No servo skull flitted across the viewport to greet them with a tinny recitation of port regulations. Nothing. A silent port. With a heavy sigh, Captain Rent turned to Father Holsek. "It might be worth delivering the Emperor's blessing upon these halls, Father. I suspect we'll find some measure of sickness or power failure. Possibly the entire station is caught in a mechanical crisis. Let's not jump to other conclusions." Yet in the gloom of the command deck, everyone's thoughts strayed to more ominous possibilities: a chaos incursion or a warp-based catastrophe. In the Imperium, one learned to suspect the worst. Rent closed her eyes briefly, reciting an ancient supplication. "Holy Emperor, guide us and preserve us from the horrors lurking in the Immaterium." Chapter 2: Silent Port. Half an hour later, an armed landing party congregated at the airlock. Captain Rent insisted on going herself, along with Tristan, Father Halsek, 2 armsmen in battered carapace gear, and 3 additional crew, senior rating officers with some experience in dealing with station personnel. No one expected open battle, but it was wise to carry laser guns and shotguns in an unknown environment. The boarding passage rumbled as the station's mag seals joined with the airlock threshold. The hiss of cycling atmosphere preceded the final shift in pressure. Then the outer hatch opened, revealing a corridor lit only by a few guttering lumen strips. It stretched forward into stale shadows that reeked of metal and old air. At first, it seemed deserted. With rifles at the ready, the group advanced in standard formation, Father Halsek in the center. He kept muttering the litanies of protection, each footstep echoing in the hush. On a typical station, they would have been greeted by servitors with clipboards or the churning bustle of cargo decks. But here they saw only rows of crates stacked aimlessly in antechambers, as though left mid-transfer. One crate had burst open, scattering dried rations across the deck. "This place can't be fully abandoned," said Captain Rent under her breath. "Gravity's still holding. The air's breathable. Life support must be functioning." Tristan held his hand up for silence. He knelt by a flickering display console near the corridor wall. After a moment, he managed to coax the screen to life. "We're in Docking Bay Epsilon, says here," he reported softly. "According to the station's schematic, the main administrative block is 3 corridors forward, 1 level up." "Then that's where we'll head," said Rent. "Stay alert." They proceeded deeper. Crushed cargo servitors lay scattered near a half-collapsed overhead crane. One had mechanical limbs pinned beneath the crane's twisted metal. Its optic lens stared lifelessly forward. Another, lying in an awkward sprawl, bore no outward damage, but its power core was dark. That was the strangest detail. None of them looked destroyed in the usual sense, There were no signs of last burn or heavy ballistic damage. It was as if they had simply ceased functioning mid-task. Every so often, the corridor lighting pulsed. In those brief flares, the walls seemed to shimmer with a slick residue, as if moisture had condensed into rivulets. Yet when the light faded, the walls appeared bone dry. Father Halsek caught Tristan's eye during one such flicker. The priest's lips parted in alarm. "Something about this place is wrong," he muttered. "The warp's shadow, perhaps." Tristan, who had little taste for the supernatural, merely set his jaw. "Focus, Father. Let's see if we can find a functioning cogitator in the administrative block." They soon reached a wide set of double doors, meant to lead into the station's interior. The metal bulkheads were carved with standard imperial iconography, battered by centuries of use. A servo skull perched on a bracket near the top, presumably once part of a scanning unit. The door itself was jammed partially open. A dim corridor lay beyond, the overhead lumens flickering in no consistent pattern. Within that corridor lay the first body they encountered. Slumped against the wall, an unarmored man in a station uniform. His eyes were open and clouded, the expression on his face one of pure terror. Father Halsek rushed forward to kneel at his side, performing the rite of the last breath. He studied the body for injuries, but found only minor bruises and contusions, nothing that would explain the man's death. Tristan placed 2 fingers upon the man's neck. No pulse. Possibly a massive shock or heart failure from fear. Captain Rent exhaled sharply. He must have died recently. There's no sign of decomposition. She was correct. Some intangible sense suggested the death was fresh. Yet the station had been unresponsive for hours. If some cataclysm had taken place, they would expect more chaos, or at least a sign of struggle. Where were the others? Grim-faced, they pressed on. Eventually, the corridor opened to a large atrium, the administrative block. Here they found old metal desks, aisles of data stacks, and scattered parchments. A faint stench drifted in the air, reminiscent of old incense gone rancid. The overhead lights flickered in a nauseating pattern, as if dancing to a hidden tune. The sense of oppression grew stronger. One of the armsmen let out a startled gasp. "Captain, look!" In the far corner, behind a collapsed stack of crates, was another figure. This one wore the regalia of a station official, brown robes with an administratum signet. The official's eyes were rolled back, lips parted as if mid-scream. His arms clutched a data slate to his chest in a death grip. Despite the horror, Tristan managed to pry the slate loose. It was cracked, but a faint glow lingered. On the screen scrolled fragments of text. Navigator Malakia in training. Sudden disturbance. Station quarantine. Unknown warp phenomenon. Time. Twisting. Cannot meltdown. Starboard sector. Emperor Pa. Tristan's breath caught in his throat. Navigator Malakia in training. Warp phenomenon. Time twisting. Emperor preserve us. He glanced at Captain Rent, who read the text over his shoulder. She drew in a slow breath and nodded. "We suspected warp-based trouble. The station's fallen to some corruption, maybe heretical, maybe a direct warp incursion." Father Halsek pressed a trembling hand to the half-sunken aquila on his chest. "Let us not speak heresy yet, but we must be vigilant. A navigator in training is far more vulnerable to the warp's insidious grasp." "Then we must see if anyone survived," Rent said, voice firm. "Our duty is to glean the truth and render assistance, or purging, if it's come to that." No one argued. The group spent the next few minutes searching for survivors, but found only deserted desks and a few more bodies. Each corpse had the same glassy-eyed dread etched into its features, as though they had all died from the terror of something. The armsmen discovered a sealed hatch that led deeper into the station, presumably toward living quarters, and if the station's layout was standard, the navigator's sanctum. In any typical station design, the navigator's quarters sat near the central spire, away from main thoroughfares, a place of heavily warded compartments. But as they advanced, an abrupt groan shuddered through the deck plating, making them pause. A wave of dizziness struck them all. Bright motes of light danced at the edges of their vision. They braced themselves against desks or pillars as the phenomenon washed over them. For a fleeting moment, the overhead lights shifted from flickering gloom to a brilliant white. Captain Rent felt an overwhelming sense of déjà vu, as if she had stepped through that corridor 1,000 times before, or had yet to do it at all. The station around them blinked. Then, as quickly as it began, the wave dissipated. In the aftershock, Father Hulsek clutched at his chest. "By the Emperor, this station is haunted by warp energies. I can taste it in the air like the breath of demons." "Stay strong," Rent commanded, though her own voice trembled slightly. "We keep moving. We'll try to locate the navigator's sanctum. Maybe we can find a way to isolate whatever this is." No one spoke further dissent. One by one, they continued onward, each step accompanied by the sense that reality itself was uncoiling around them. Chapter 3: Echoes of the Past. They descended a spiral staircase leading to what the battered station signage called the Spinal Concourse. Rust had eaten away at the metal banister. The deeper they went, the more the entire station seemed wreathed in an almost dreamlike gloom. They passed locked storerooms and maintenance passages, some sealed by auto doors that refused to budge, despite repeated attempts with override codes. Eventually, they came upon an intersection of corridors that fanned out in 4 directions. A plaque overhead marked them as access corridors to the station's main lifter shafts, living quarters, shrines, and a branch heading toward an engineerium sublevel. They paused, uncertain which route to take. Something scuttled in the darkness down the left corridor. Everyone froze, weapons raised. The armsman nearest the corridor flicked on his shoulder lumen. It cut through the gloom in stuttering arcs, but revealed no living figure, only a wall streaked with some blackish residue. The group's tension mounted. "We move in pairs," said Captain Rent softly. "Hale, you take Father Hulsek and 1 armsman to check the living quarters. I'll go with the other armsman and the rest to search the shrine area. We regroup here in 15 minutes if we find nothing." Reluctantly, they split, each group lugging a short-range Vox and a glow lamp. The corridor to the shrine was wide, partially lined with metallic effigies of imperial saints. The gloom made them appear like towering wraiths. Captain Rent felt her heartbeat pounding in her ears as they advanced. All at once, the overhead lumen snapped on at full brightness. The corridor was momentarily illuminated in antiseptic light, revealing the statues in harsh detail. She glimpsed the sculpted face of St. Drusus, twisted in a silent scream. Though she knew it was a standard mold, the expression seemed uncannily lifelike. Then the lights went out. The corridor plunged back into darkness, leaving only the harsh beam of her hand-held glow lamp. A sudden click, click, click echoed from behind the statue. Rent and the armsman jumped, weapons trained. Nothing emerged, but Captain Rent's mouth went dry. She could have sworn she saw a hunched silhouette, as though something had perched behind the statue's pedestal. The armsman risked stepping closer, shining his lumen over the area. The metal was slick and empty. "It's gone," he whispered. But Rent felt no relief. Something was stalking them in the darkness. She gritted her teeth, continuing past the line of looming saintly effigies. all the while whispering in her mind, "Throne, preserve me. Throne, preserve us all." They turned a corner into a small chapel. Rows of benches faced an altar that likely housed a statue of the emperor, though that statue had toppled to the floor. Bits of hammered gold lay scattered about. The frontal wall was covered in a swirling pattern, reminiscent of the Imperium's aquila, but mutated into shapes that defied sense, arches that connected where they shouldn't, angles that seemed to shift when the eye moved. It left the watchers dizzy. "May the Emperor guard our souls," the armsman muttered. Rent examined the altar. Cracked candles were strewn about, and congealed wax formed bizarre lumps. She knelt to examine a set of footprints in the dust. Someone had paced around the dais, leaving half-bare footprints that looked incomplete, like multiple overlapping outlines. The edges of the footprints looked as though they blurred or repeated. Before she could ponder further, a clang echoed from the corridor. Instantly, she and her companions turned to see the open doorway. The corridor beyond was pitch black, yet just for an instant, they saw a flicker of movement. A robed figure gliding past, heading deeper into the station's bowels. Rent's heart lurched. After it, they sprinted back into the corridor, the armsman struggling to keep the lumen trained on the fleeting shape. The figure moved unnaturally fast, though no footsteps could be heard. All that remained was a faint rustling, a gentle whisper. They followed it around a bend, deeper and deeper, until they emerged into a corridor of open plan that led to an observation dome. Here, the dome's wide viewport displayed the cold tapestry of space outside. In normal times, the glow of distant stars or the station's external lumen arrays might have given the dome a serene cast. Now, everything was in darkness, except for the occasional strobe from the station's malfunctioning external floodlights. The robed figure was nowhere in sight, but something else demanded attention. A corpse pinned to the glass. A man, presumably a station deck officer, was spread-eagled against the inside of the viewport, limbs contorted. His flesh had fused to the glass in impossible ways, as if metal and meat had intermingled. Part of his face was submerged in the glass itself. Even from several paces away, Captain Rent could hear the faint crackle of tortured bone. She clenched her jaw, fighting the urge to vomit. Her armsman gagged at the sight. The swirl of warp-tainted phenomenon must have wrought this gruesome fate. No conventional explanation existed for a body fused into glass. A faint shiver of movement seized the corpse's lips. Impossible though it seemed, it tried to open its mouth. A wet, rattling sound emerged, half-choked. It reminded Rent of someone drowning. She wanted to rush over, but dread held her in place. The drowned rattle formed a single word. Way. Rent stared, eyes brimming with horror and pity. The armsman whispered, "He's alive?" Almost in answer, the entire corpse convulsed, the glass around it flickering with what looked like phantasmal lines of energy. Then, abruptly, it went still. The internal tension vanished. With a hideous slurp, the body partially slid down the viewport, leaving a smear of flesh behind, though it remained partly attached. Rent gripped her weapon. She fought to maintain composure. Then she heard faint static from her belt vox. She snatched it up. "Hale, is that you?" Amid the crackle, Tristan's voice came through, breathless. "Cap, we found... Throne. Living quarters. Come quickly. Need help." The link fizzled. But there was no doubt about the urgency in Tristan's tone. "Let's go," Rent said, voice tight. She and her armsman left that unspeakable sight behind, hurrying back the way they had come, all the while expecting to see the robed figure at every turn. Yet the corridors were eerily empty, as though the entire station held its breath, waiting. Chapter 4. The Dying Echoes. Rent's group wound back to the four-way intersection, only to find it deserted. Tristan and Father Halsek were not there, though the plan was to regroup after 15 minutes. Nearly 20 had passed. Rent's anxiety grew. She tried the short-range Vox again, receiving nothing but static. "Time's slipping," the armsman said. "Feels like it's only been a few minutes since we split." Rent exhaled. "Come on, we'll follow the route to the living quarters. If they're in trouble, we can't wait." That corridor extended along a row of sealed metal doors, each presumably leading to private quarters or bunk rooms for station staff. Some doors hung ajar, revealing ransacked living spaces, bedding tossed about, personal effects left behind in disarray. One room they passed reeked of scorched incense, the walls stained by black residue forming bizarre swirling patterns. Then they turned a corner and found 3 sets of bunks stacked along one wall. Blood spatter dotted the floor. A man's corpse, arms outstretched, lay half inside one of the bunks. The uniform identified him as a low-ranking station worker. His back was arched at an impossible angle, as though seized in mid-agonized contortion. A single black bruise marred his forehead. Captain Rent's breath hissed out from between clenched teeth. "Stay together," she warned the armsman, stepping gingerly around the corpse. Further down, she saw an open doorway with a faint flicker of light inside. She gestured for the armsman to cover her, then advanced. The interior was a communal lounge area, a few battered chairs, a hololithic projector now cracked and static-filled. Father Halsek lay on the floor, unconscious or worse. Tristan knelt beside him, pressing a piece of cloth to a wound on the priest's head. Another armsman hovered near them, looking spooked. "Emperor's grace, Captain," Tristan exclaimed as soon as Rent stepped through the doorway. "Halsek got separated from us after a phenomenon, some sort of corridor shift. He's alive, but only barely. The warp energies are saturating this place. We found something else too." He gestured toward a corner of the lounge, where a battered metal door led to an adjoining chamber. The door's auto-seal was jammed open. Beyond it lay a small bunk room. Inside was a battered data slate on a table, still glowing with fragments of text. Tristan had apparently set it aside. Rent took a moment to examine Father Halsek. The priest was breathing shallowly, a bruise forming on his temple. She pressed her lips tight. "We need to get him stable. Then you can tell me what you found." It took a few precious minutes for them to revive Halsek with a pungent stim. He moaned, blinking groggily. "The corridor, it changed. I was reciting wards, and the walls closed in." Rent nodded sympathetically, though her mind was already fixated on the mention of new data. "Tristan, what about the data slate?" Wordlessly, he handed it over. Flickering lines scrolled across it. House Kafar, navigator in training. Malakia Kafar, eccentric. Potential for advanced warp scrying. Senior navigator reports unusual warp anomalies, citing possibility of corruption. Increased unpredictability. Subject is quarantined in Sanctum. Disturbances accelerating. Time distortion events. Loss of command staff. Engineerium meltdown. No known solution. Emperor have mercy. Rent's hands tightened around the slate. So the rumors are true. The station was home to a navigator in training, Malakia, and something about his powers. Maybe he let the warp in. Father Halsek, fighting to clear his vision, mumbled, "Navigators are sanctioned mutants, trained to bear the warp's gaze. But if he was untrained or compromised by a demon, it could tear open reality." Tristan nodded. "We suspect the effect is warping space and time. That's why we keep experiencing these pulses, these flickers of memory or advanced illusions." Captain Rent took a deep breath. It may be that Malakia is still alive, out there, either enthralled by some warp entity or mutated beyond reason. If we locate him, perhaps we can seal away the warp breach. She paused, looking around at the battered lounge. But first, we must see if there's any safe place to gather ourselves. We can't keep wandering aimlessly. One armsman coughed. Captain, with respect, we should also consider leaving. The Ascendant Mercy can detach from the dock, seal the airlock, and jump clear. We can contact the authorities for a quarantine. This station might be beyond saving. Father Halsek, face pale, responded, to flee might doom these souls entirely, and if the warp breach spreads. Rent cut in, her tone quiet but firm. We will attempt to rescue who we can. But if we find no survivors, or if the threat is too great, I won't risk the entire crew. Understood? They all nodded. The Emperor's mercy was not infinite, nor was the risk they could take. Chapter 5. Into the Belly of Shadows. The group pressed onward, deeper into the station's labyrinthine decks. Their path was guided partly by guesswork, partly by half-functional station schematics gleaned from battered consoles. They pieced together the route to the navigator's sanctum, a specialized suite that was often hidden behind gene-locked doors. As they ventured deeper, the phenomenon worsened. They heard footsteps echoing in corridors where no figure could be seen. Lights flickered in deliberate sequences, as though a presence was leading them. Once, the entire station seemed to shift, throwing them off balance. Time-lost illusions bled into their perceptions. Captain Rent glimpsed shapes from her childhood, her father's face in the gloom, or the Ascendant Mercy's old corridor back home. She forced them away by reciting litanies she learned from Father Holsek. In a crossway near the station's center, they found more survivors, or so they initially believed. They saw a cluster of 4 figures in station uniforms, crouched around a half-lit servo console. But as soon as Rent's group approached, these figures turned. Their faces were empty shells, features stretched taut. Dark hollows replaced eyes. In unison they opened their mouths wide, revealing black voids instead of tongues or throats. A wave of terror gripped the visitors. Father Halsek brandished his Aquila amulet, shouting, "Begone, vile illusions!" The 4 figures advanced in jerky motions. One armsman fired a lasburst, and the bolt seemed to flicker through them, as though striking a silhouette. Then the illusions dissolved in a swirl of dark mist that seeped into the floor. Only a scorched scorch mark remained, where the last bolt impacted the deck plating. Rent realized she was trembling. "Keep your wits, everyone. These illusions are designed to shatter our morale." The illusions were increasingly elaborate. They heard disembodied voices beckoning them down certain paths. Sometimes they witnessed partial reenactments of station life, a corridor filled with bustling staff, only for it all to vanish when they blinked. The station was a labyrinth of half-truths and nightmares, time folding over itself. At length, they reached a large, sealed door bearing the stylized eye of the navigator's houses. The lock panel flickered with dim runes. This had to be the entrance to Malakia Kafar's quarters, or his prison. "Stand back," Tristan warned, stepping up to the panel. He studied it for a moment, then tapped a few commands. Sparks flew from the mechanism. "Gene lock engaged. We can try a manual override, but it might trigger failsafes." An ominous hum filled the corridor, making the walls vibrate. Captain Rent's stomach churned. "Do it quickly. We can't stay here." Tristan yanked open the panel's side to reveal a snarl of cables. Father Holsek lifted a small devotional candle from his kit, intending to read a prayer of sanctification. Before he could even speak, the station lights went out completely. Pitch blackness reigned. A hiss echoed behind them. like the slither of an animal crawling across the deck. Rent flicked on her weapon lumen. The beam sliced into darkness to reveal one of the armsmen lying face down on the deck. "Agril," she whispered, flicking the beam around. "Where's the other armsman?" No reply. She advanced warily, crouching to check the fallen man's vitals. He was dead, eyes blank, no wound, no sign of a struggle. It was as though his heart had simply stopped. Footsteps behind. Rent spun around, the light slashing the gloom. Something robed and hunched was standing just at the edge of her lumen's range, swaying. A slender shape with elongated limbs, face covered by a hood. The figure lifted a hand, revealing long, bony digits. A voice, ragged and inhuman, drifted through the hush. "Why do you come?" Rent felt her heart hammer. She aimed her las pistol. "Identify yourself." The robed shape took a step closer. Now she could see the faint glimmer of a third eye on its forehead, partially obscured by a cowl. A navigator's eye, or what had become of it. A faint swirl of warp light shimmered around that ocular cavity. "Go from here, or be undone," the figure rasped, voice echoing in 1,000 discordant tones. Rent caught a whiff of something rancid, like a decaying sea creature. She could almost feel the warp's oppressive aura emanating from this being. She forced steel into her voice. "Malakia Kafar, if that's you. The station is dying. Release it from whatever corruption you've unleashed." The figure did not react in a human way. Instead, it angled its head as though listening to far-off voices. Then it emitted a low, keening sound, stepping backward into the gloom. "I cannot control it. It sees. It sees." Suddenly, the warp aura pulsed. Captain Rent's vision swam. She glimpsed wild images. A swirl of flesh, corridors collapsing into themselves, a star devoured by an immense vortex. She fought to remain conscious, but some psychic force battered her senses. She felt her nose bleed. When she recovered, the figure was gone. She could only hear its ragged words echoing in her mind. "It sees." "Captain!" Tristan's shout pierced her daze. She turned to see him prying open the sealed door. Father Halsek knelt near the console, chanting a ward. The final armsman stood guard, face pale. Rent stumbled over, wiping blood from her nostrils. "We have to get inside." If that was Malakia, he might have retreated within. Tristan yanked on a lever, and the lock disengaged with a metallic groan. The door slid open just enough for them to slip through. Chapter 6. The Sanctum. Inside, the walls bore intricate gilded reliefs of swirling patterns reminiscent of the warp. High-backed chairs, a chart table, and long drapes gave the room an eerie opulence. This was the outer chamber of a navigator's sanctum, where they meditated or studied the warp. A single corridor branched off to what presumably was the personal suite. The moment the door sealed behind them, the wave of warp phenomena outside seemed to recede. The overhead luminators flickered on with surprising steadiness, albeit tinted a dull red. The air was heavy with the scent of old incense, pungent and cloying. "This place feels different," Father Halsek murmured, unsteady on his feet, as though a bubble of partial stability remains, thanks to the wards etched on the walls. Indeed, the gilded designs formed a protective pattern, presumably meant to shield a navigator's meditative space from uncontrolled warp intrusion. Something had twisted them, but vestiges of that protection might linger. Tristan pointed his laser gun toward the corridor. "Shall we?" Rent nodded, though dread gnawed at her. They moved as a group, stepping into a small hallway that ended in another door carved with the triple-eyed symbol of the Navis nobility. A hush hung here, thick as tar. When they opened the door, they found a single large chamber lined with strange apparatus, benches, psi-ward staves, half-broken astrolithic devices. At the far side, a dais supported a tall seat that was ringed with cables and ducting. This was the navigator's throne, used during warp passage. Lying face down at the base of the throne was a motionless shape in richly embroidered robes. The occupant's body looked warped and elongated. Slowly, as the group approached, the figure twitched. Captain Rent inhaled sharply. Perhaps this was Malakia, or a caretaker. She signaled Tristan and the armsman to keep their distance, while Father Halsek advanced cautiously with his aquila raised. The figure stirred. Its hood slipped down, revealing a hairless scalp with protrusions that might have once been a third eye. The face was twisted, the bone structure elongated, the mouth partially fused shut. With a wet rasp, it turned its head to look at them. A wave of pity and revulsion churned in Rent's gut. This was no ordinary navigator. It was a tortured abomination, presumably once a teacher or senior navigator. Its eyes fixed on Father Halsek's aquila, and it jerked away with a hiss. A strangled gurgle left its throat. Then, to everyone's horror, it spoke in High Gothic, though garbled. You must end it. The child, so much power, cannot contain. Twisted. He sees the warp unfiltered, unstoppable now. Rent stepped forward, bracing her pistol. Child, you mean Malakia? The robed creature convulsed, clawing at its face. He was too young. Illusions. Time undone. The station trapped in the warp's jaws. Can't escape. The father was House Kafar. They tried, oh Emperor, tried. Its voice broke into choking sobs. Father Halsek looked on in pained compassion. We need to free the station from this torment. How? The creature twitched violently, raw spittle flecking its lips. It tried to raise a hand, gesturing behind the throne to a sealed door or hatch. He is in the eye, the warp's eye. Then with a final shriek, the robed figure seized. The entire body constricted into a paroxysm of muscle tension. Bones snapped. With a sickening crack, the chest caved in and the creature collapsed, lifeless. Silence fell in the chamber, except for the heaving breaths of the group. Tristan approached the indicated hatch behind the navigator's throne. Jean locked again. If Malakia is beyond there, we might need a more direct method to bypass it. Melter charges or a cutting torch. I'm not certain we should open it, muttered the armsman. What if we're unleashing something worse? Rent's voice was grim. It's not a matter of risk. We can't leave the warp's hold to fester. If Malakia is fueling it, we must do something. They examined the hatch. The lock was advanced, with layers of esoteric wards. Possibly it had been the final barrier to keep Malakia's raw power contained. Tristan rummaged through the room's storage for any clue. He found a set of strange rods with scrawled instructions in archaic script. Emergency overload. Possibly a means of meltdown if the navigator lost control. While Tristan worked, Father Halsek paced around the throne, reciting from the litany of abjuration. The chanting steadied them all, but the oppressive sense of cosmic dread did not diminish. The station rumbled occasionally, each wave sending shivers through the deck plates. Finally, Tristan managed to wire the rods to the lock mechanism, aligning them with the wards. A small panel lit up. Runes scrolled across the screen, flickering. He input a code gleaned from the scribbled instructions. With a grinding shriek, the hatch parted. A wave of stale, cold air spilled into the Sanctum. Chapter 7. The Warp's Eye. Beyond the hatch lay a small corridor culminating in a circular chamber. The walls were lined with swirling runes reminiscent of the warp. A single high-backed seat stood at the center, covered by metal plating that served as a harness. It reminded Rent of a smaller, more personal navigator's throne. In that seat was Malakia Kafar, a boy of perhaps 16 standard years, though twisted by the navigator gene. His hairless head lolled to one side, and a band of metal covered his forehead, presumably to seal the third eye. Cables emerged from the harness, feeding into the walls, pulsing with a sickly glow. He was breathing, barely. At the group's entrance, his eyes fluttered open. They were dark orbs flecked with swirling color, reminiscent of warp storm clouds. "Stay back," Rent said, though no one else had moved. She and Tristan crept closer, weapons half raised. The armsmen hovered at their flank, scanning for danger. Father Hulsek pressed a trembling hand to his Aquila. Malakia's lips parted. His voice was so soft they had to lean in to hear. "I see. All time. All possibilities. It's so loud." Rent forced down her fear. "Malakia, do you understand us? The station is dying because of your power. Can you stop it? Or can we help you?" A shiver passed through him. "I tried to close the eye. They told me not to open it. But the warp called. It's alive. It seeped in." Tristan exchanged a nervous glance with Father Hulsek. The priest approached, speaking gently. "Son, the warp is monstrous. Your gift was to guide starships. Instead, you've been exposed to the raw immaterium. We must end this connection, or the station, and possibly many more, will be consumed." Malakia's voice cracked into a half sob, half laugh. "Consumed? Yes, it already is. Time loops on itself. The Geller wards shattered. The station is stuck between real space and the warp. The illusions, devour them. I can't. Turn it off." Rent felt a surge of sympathy. He was a child, albeit a dangerous one. Is there a way to sever the link? If you're at the center, can you break free? He twitched violently. The cables around the harness sparked. There is only the last measure, the meltdown, but that will kill everything. The meltdown was supposed to sever me from life. Tristan turned to the group, voice shaking. "Captain, that might be the best chance. A meltdown of the station's warp-based systems. Possibly the reactor is linked to the Sanctum to power the navigator's seat. If it's destroyed, the warp incursion might collapse." Malakia's voice turned reedy, eyes rolling back. Yes, destroy me. Destroy this shell. Otherwise the warp will feed on me forever. It will expand, unstoppable. The illusions will consume. Father Halsek tried to speak, but his voice faltered at the enormity. "Child, is there truly no other way? We can take you to the Inquisition. They might." "No." Malaga's shriek reverberated in the chamber, warping the air. The deck plates rattled. "They can't help me. It's too late." A sudden pulse of warp energy erupted from Malakia's harness, slamming into them. Captain Rent felt her mind reel with hallucinations. She stood again aboard the Ascendant Mercy, her father greeting her. Then a swirl of color replaced that vision. She saw monstrous shapes prowling a corridor lined with corpses. Time, the future, the past, it all bled together. She screamed, fighting to hold on to reality. When the wave subsided, the armsman lay convulsing on the floor. Blood trickled from his eyes. Father Halsek crouched, hugging his head. Tristan clutched the harness for stability, panting. Malakia's tears flowed freely. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I can't hold it in." Rent forced herself to her feet. "We do it," she rasped. "We finish this. Tristan, how do we trigger the meltdown?" He swallowed hard. We saw references to meltdown sequences in the Engineerium, possibly the override rods we found. If we can reach the station's main reactor core, we might be able to set it to overload. That should collapse the warp rift. It will probably destroy everything else. Malakia nodded. Go. Quickly. Time here. A labyrinth. Father Halsek hesitated, tears in his eyes. May the Emperor's light give you solace, child. The boy's mouth curled into a small, sad smile. The Emperor is too far away to hear. Rent did not linger. She grabbed the meltdown rods Tristan had stowed and turned away. They would set the meltdown, then flee to the Ascendant Mercy, if possible. As they left Malakia's presence, the corridor behind them resonated with the boy's final wail, part despair, part ecstasy. Their footsteps echoed hollowly against the walls of the Sanctum, overshadowed by the feeling that they walked not just away from him, but away from the last fragile barrier, keeping the warp from fully devouring the station. Chapter 8. Into the machine's heart. They retraced their path through the twisted corridors, heading for the Engineerium. The station's meltdown controls were presumably there. Massive plasma reactors powering life support, lighting, docking mechanisms, everything. If they could overload the reactor in a controlled manner, they'd create a catastrophic surge that would annihilate the entire station, and hopefully the warp incursion along with it. But the station fought them at every turn. Hallways looped back on themselves, doors led to unexpected chambers, and illusions taunted them with visions of safety. Several times, they stumbled upon corpses of station staff in horrifying states of mutation, limbs fused to walls or heads warped into half-demonic shapes. Whispers in the gloom beckoned them to linger. When they finally spotted signage for the Engineerium, it was sealed by a thick bulkhead. The group wrenched it open, step by step, using servo-assisted levers. Inside, a wide staircase led down to the main reactor floor. The air was thick, humid, and laced with the tang of ozone. Below they saw an immense plasma reactor caged in a lattice of metal girders. Great coils snaked in and out of coolant tanks. The entire structure hissed and spat arcs of energy that danced among the walkways. Lumens flickered like dying candles. Captain Rent paused. We plant the meltdown rods into the core controls, presumably. Tristan rummaged for the scribbled instructions from the navigator's sanctum. Yes, we connect them to the failsafe ports, flooding the reactor with feedback. The meltdown should be unstoppable once triggered, with a short countdown. Then we run for the ship. Father Halsek peered over the walkway's railing, sweat beading on his brow. That leaves precious little time to escape. The Emperor guide our steps. Rent took the rods in her arms. She gave them each a meaningful look. This is it. Let's see it through. We shall not let the warp claim more victims. They descended the steps. Steam and sparks cascaded around them. Each hiss and clang seemed to carry an echo of monstrous laughter. Warp fire flickered in the corners of the Engineerium, forming half-shaped illusions. Once, Rent nearly shot a shape that resembled a giant, insectile demon. It vanished as her finger pressed the trigger, leaving only an afterimage of swirling color. Near the base of the reactor, they found a console with multiple ports, matching the design of the meltdown rods. Tristan got to work, sliding them into place, reciting the Emperor's litany to calm his frayed nerves. Father Halsek oversaw, murmuring prayers of exorcism. Rent scanned the shadows behind them. The feeling of being watched intensified. She feared that Malakia, or something wearing his face, might appear and halt their efforts. The rods clacked into position. Runes flared on the console. Meltdown initiation. Then a grim countdown began flashing in low Gothic numerals. 300, 299, 298. Tristan's face was ashen. 5 minutes, perhaps. We run. They rushed back up the stairs. Just as they reached the bulkhead at the top, the station trembled violently. A warp-laced quake tore through the decks. Captain Rent nearly lost her footing. She heard the metal groan, as if the entire station threatened to tear itself apart. Then the corridor overhead split. Sections of plating folded like paper, unveiling a swirling mass of color beyond, as if space itself had peeled back. Through that shimmering Rent glimpsed demonic faces, twisting in ecstasy. Fingers of warp energy slithered into the corridor. Father Hulsek screamed, brandishing his aquila and chanting. One of those warp tendrils coiled around Father Hulsek's leg. He shrieked in agony as it yanked him upward. His flesh began to bubble, and he dropped his amulet. Rent lunged for him, but was forced back by a wave of heat, or perhaps psychic force. Tristan tried to aim his laser gun at the tendril, but the shot fizzled in the swirling energies. Hulsek's final cry rang out, "Emperor!" Then his voice cut off. His body was dragged into that Rent. The last they saw of him was a contorted silhouette, arms outstretched. The tear snapped shut, sealing him away. Rent stared at the spot, numb with horror. She pressed on, adrenaline fueling every step, forcibly blocking out the guilt that threatened to paralyze her. They had mere minutes. If they tarried, all would die in vain. Chapter 9. Escape, or something else. Tristan, Rent, and the single surviving armsman sprinted through the corridors. 150, 149, 148. The meltdown countdown ticked away in their minds. The station's geometry was in total flux now. Bulkheads warped, hallways bent at angles that defied logic. Sometimes the floor pitched, forcing them to climb as though on a steep incline. Lights flashed in chaotic bursts. Time stuttered. They found themselves repeating the same corridor. "We'll never make it," the armsman panted, eyes wild. "We'll be lost in these loops forever." Tristan clenched his teeth. "We have to push on." They forced themselves to remain calm, ignoring illusions. At one point, Captain Rent glimpsed the observation dome where the corpse had been fused to the viewport. But the corridor changed halfway, leading them to the docking ring. She recognized the battered crates from before. They had found the docking bay. She let out a breath of relief. 70 seconds. 60. Time was impossible to measure precisely, but it felt like the meltdown was dangerously close. They ran to the airlock connecting to the Ascendant Mercy. The mag seals were still engaged. Lights flickered green. Pressure was stable. They piled into the airlock, hammered the controls. With a protesting groan, the hatch sealed behind them. Rent opened the comlink to the Ascendant Mercy's command deck. "Bridge, do you read? This is Captain Rent. We're initiating emergency departure. Clear the docking clamp." Static. Then a garbled voice. "Cap. Docking release. Malfunction. Engineerium. To override." Rent's heart dropped. The meltdown's destructive energies were likely jamming signals. She tried again, yelling, "Cut it from your side if you must." Tristan hammered on the manual release. The armsman tried to sever the clamp's cables with a servo cutter. Time was slipping away. Outside, the station rumbled violently. Suddenly, the clamps disengaged with a loud clang. The door hissed open, leading them into the Ascendant Mercy's corridor. Tristan and the armsman leapt inside, but Rent froze. Something was behind them. She turned to see Malakir, standing at the edge of the station corridor, his cowl down, the third eye uncovered. Warp energies crackled around him. He stared at her with an expression of profound sorrow. "I cannot die alone," he whispered. "The warp has me in its jaws. Please." She was torn. The meltdown would obliterate him if he remained. Perhaps it was best for the entire Imperium that he be consumed, and yet some motherly instinct rose in her. He was still just a boy. Her hesitation proved fatal. As the meltdown reached its final moments, arcs of plasma began surging through the station's structure. The corridor behind Malakia imploded in a vortex of rainbow-colored swirl. She felt a crushing wave of heat and psychic pressure. Tristan pulled her arm. "Captain, we must go." Rent stumbled through the airlock, tears burning her eyes. Malakia's slender form was devoured by the swirling warp lights, or perhaps by the meltdown's unstoppable fury. The airlock slammed shut behind them. They rushed to the Ascendant Mercy's bridge. On arrival, the sight outside the forward view screens made them recoil. The station was contorting, fracturing into shapes that defied geometry. Bolts of plasmic energy erupted from within. Then, with a flash that momentarily outshone the distant stars, Circanum Station exploded in a silent conflagration of metal shards and warp fire. Shrieks of 1,000 souls, or illusions thereof, rippled through the ship's vox for a heartbeat, then vanished. The meltdown had completed its destructive purpose. "Engage thrusters," Rent yelled, sinking into the command throne. "Get us clear of the blast radius." The helmsman complied, and the Ascendant Mercy pulled away from the station's final death throes. For a moment, relief fluttered across the bridge. They had escaped. The meltdown had presumably severed the warp breach. But in Warhammer 40,000, such salvation is rarely so simple. Chapter 10. The Shattered Truth. 3 days later, the Ascendant Mercy drifted in real space. Their navigator for warp travel, an older woman named Orietta, refused to chart a jump. She claimed that the warp felt wrong. Captain Rent, mind reeling from the trauma, insisted they put as much distance as possible from the station's coordinates. The ship's crew tried to return to routine, though haunted by nightmares of what they'd seen. Father Hulsek was gone, presumably consumed. The armsman who survived was catatonic, locked in the infirmary. Tristan and Rent alone seemed functional, if one could call it that. Then the illusions began. Small at first, strange reflections in corridor windows, fleeting shapes. Crew members reported hearing footsteps that matched no living person. The ship's temperature controls fluctuated at random. Orietta confronted Captain Rent with wide, fearful eyes. "Captain, the warp outside is corrosive. We are not free. Something followed us." Rent's skin crawled. She recalled Malakia's final words. "I cannot die alone. The warp has me in its jaws." Had a fragment of the warp incursion latched onto their hull, or their minds? Within hours, the illusions intensified. Key systems began to fail. The Engineerium staff reported shorting relays and half-sentient flickers of energy dancing around the plasma reactors. A stench of burnt incense filled the corridors. In the command deck, sometimes the consoles displayed glimpses of the destroyed station's interior, an impossible feed from a place that no longer existed. Tristan cornered Captain Rent in her private cabin, panic etched into every line of his face. "It's the same phenomenon, Livia. The meltdown didn't sever the warp rift. It must have latched onto Malakia or part of him. Now it's traveling with us." She sank onto her bunk, trembling. "That can't be. We saw the station torn apart. He must have anchored the warp incursion to Ascendant Mercy before the meltdown. Or maybe we breathed it in. The meltdown might have severed the large incursion, but this echo remains." They looked at each other in silent horror. If that were true, the entire vessel could become a new cradle for warp corruption, condemning thousands of souls aboard to madness and mutation. Outside in the corridor, a scream pierced the air. Rent rushed to investigate, Tristan following. They found a rating kneeling over a half-melted shape that had once been his bunkmate. The rating cradled the remains, sobbing hysterically. The walls around them shimmered like molten metal. The illusions blossomed further. More screams rose, more voices cried out. Rent felt her heart pounding as the corridors seemed to shift, replicating the labyrinthine horror of Circinum Station. The meltdown rods had destroyed the station, but the root cause, Malachia's warp breach, lived on, nested like a parasite in their vessel. Within hours, entire decks were cut off, sealed behind malfunctioning doors. The warp illusions stalked the halls, flickers of robed shapes, twisted lumps of flesh, the echoing voice of Malachia calling for help. The few loyal armsmen tried to quell panic, but it was too late. People were found contorted, fused to the ship's bulkheads. Rent, Tristan, and a handful of survivors barricaded themselves in the command deck. With the Geller field still intact within the ship, barely, they hoped that could hold back the worst of the infiltration. But the illusions seeped through cracks in reality. The machine spirit of the ship howled in vox speakers, chanting in a distorted version of Father Hulsig's voice. In the final hours, Tristan found Rent standing at the command throne. She clutched a data slate in one hand, a desperate attempt to hail Imperial authorities. The vox sputtered static. She turned to him, tear tracks streaking her grime-smeared cheeks. "We can't let this spread. If we jump into warp, the breach will amplify. If we stay in real space, eventually some other vessel might find us and suffer the same fate." Tristan swallowed. Self-destruct. The ship's meltdown protocols are nowhere near as large as the station's. We can blow ourselves apart, but we have to be sure. For the Emperor. She nodded, looking far older than her years. "Emperor, forgive me. Let it end here. We must not pass on this curse." Together they accessed the Ascendant Mercy's ancient meltdown controls. The code was rarely used, but every starship had a final contingency. With shaking hands, Rent initiated the sequence. Explosive meltdown in T-15 minutes. They tried to rally any survivors to the hangar bays or lifeboats, but illusions plagued every corridor. The few huddled souls that made it to the command deck coughed and wept. Tristan vented his heartbreak in curses. Rent recognized her duty. She repeated stoically, "We do not let the warp spread." At minute 7, the meltdown sequence began spitting arcs of plasma through the lower decks. The illusions reached a crescendo. Captain Rent glimpsed entire sections of the ship, replaced by visions of Circinum Station's chapel, or the observation dome with the fused corpse, or Malachia's huddled form. She heard the voice of Father Hulsig, chanting the Emperor's litany in a mocking tone. At minute 3, Tristan collapsed, eyes rolling back as if confronted by an unspeakable horror. His last word was, "No," before his face slackened. Another meltdown wave rattled the command deck. The overhead lumens flickered. Rent alone remained upright, pressing her hand to the meltdown override, ensuring it stayed locked. 2 minutes, 1 minute, 30 seconds. Her final prayer was to the Emperor. She tried to form the words, but only tears came. The illusions parted for a moment, revealing a shimmering shape, Malachia, or a fragment of his soul, looking upon her with sorrowful eyes. The countdown hit 0. A white-hot flash consumed the Ascendant Mercy. Epilogue, the eternal scream. In the silent void, there is no sound. The Ascendant Mercy vanished in a brilliant burst of light, scattering fragments across a lonely star system. No distress call survived, no rescue arrived. In the official Imperial records, the station known as Circinum, along with the merchant vessel assigned to it, simply disappeared. Lost to the warp's countless anomalies, presumed destroyed by mechanical failure or unknown contact. Yet in the darkness beyond mortal ken, echoes remain. Those echoes swirl among the tides of the warp, carrying the memory of Malakia Kafar's raw, uncontrolled psychic scream, and the final despairing breath of Captain Rent and her crew. Fragments of that scream drift across the immaterium, an endless lament of an untrained navigator devoured by cosmic forces, and a lonely merchant ship forever entombed in the nightmares that only the warp can conjure. Perhaps in some twisted corridor of non-reality, a fraction of the Ascendant Mercy still exists, its halls looping endlessly, its crew cursed to relive their final hours, never dying yet never escaping. A pocket dimension adrift, outside time. Or perhaps they are merely dust and memory, redeemed by their sacrifice as the meltdown scoured the warp's foothold from real space. The Imperium, vast and unyielding, neither mourns nor recalls them. Life continues across a million other worlds. In the great ledger of the Adeptus Administratum, their names are but a footnote, scrawled in red ink, missing, presumed dead. Such is the grim truth of the 41st millennium. In a universe beset on all sides by monstrosities, mortal minds can scarcely comprehend. There are no assurances, no neat endings, no triumphant clarions. There is only the next crisis, the next cosmic horror lurking beyond the flickering lights. And so ends the tale of Circinum Station and the Ascendant Mercy. The warp's laughter echoes still, a mocking testament to the fragile line between reality and nightmare. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is no dawn, no solace, only the hush of cold stars and the silent eternal scream of those consumed by the endless void. Thus ends our harrowing journey into the heart of the void. In the Emperor's gaze, none can hide from the terrors lurking just beyond the threshold of our senses. If you found yourself enthralled by the shadows of this tale, be sure to subscribe, like, and share this video with fellow souls brave enough to face the horrors of the 41st millennium. Strike the bell icon that you may be among the first to stand witness to future revelations here on Grimdark Shards. Until our next venture into the maw of darkness, may the Emperor guide your steps, and may you never stray from the light, for all too soon the shadows come calling.